Hi, my name is Nicole Van Tassel, and I'm the founder of I Explore Science. I'm also a middle school science teacher. And in case we haven't met, okay, so last week I actually sent out an email about how my school was adopting this. I call them canned curriculum. I mean, they're just curricula, but they are very teacher driven. It is a step by step, do this lesson, do this lesson, do this lesson. And that's totally how I used to design lessons. So I get it. But if you've been following me for a while, you know that I am like all about that student driven approach. So my school's adopting this or has adopted or whatever, or they're ordering it, this curriculum. I started going through the first unit and I kind of started freaking out a little bit because it was very teacher driven and the phenomenon wasn't great. And at first I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to use this? How am I going to give my students choice and voice and embrace their curiosity and yet follow this very step-by-step curriculum with a meh phenomenon? The phenomenon itself wasn't bad. I do want to clarify. I think it's interesting. The way that students are meant to engage with it is very limited. It was pretty much just like, hey, this thing happened. And you just like tell students or show students. And that's not engaging, right? We need to activate their curiosity. So in my email last week, I shared how I freaked out a little bit. And what I found was really helpful, though, I went back to, I want to say like my roots, which when I'm developing a unit from scratch, I don't, I mean, I have whole courses on that explain this process, but basically, the core component, this first step here, is I think about my phenomenon and I ask myself, what questions would this phenomenon spark? What questions would my students ask after they have interacted or experienced or learned about or whatever this phenomenon? So that's what I did with this curriculum. Instead of thinking about all the lessons and looking at all the nitty gritty components, and I'm just like, okay, if my students interact with this, and I do need to revamp how they interact with it, but if my students interact with this phenomenon, engage with it, explore it, what questions are they going to ask? And I started listing my questions. And then I started to see connections to actually other units. And what I've decided to do with this unit, because it's not very student driven, there's not a lot of choice in terms of how it unfolds. What I've decided to do instead is actually combine a couple of the different units with this curriculum. And I'm not going to get into specifics. And I know that's vague and kind of hard to understand, but I decided to combine a couple of the units where there were connection points from that list of questions. And I'm kind of making like this amalgam unit. Okay, so a follow-up question I got, and that's what this video is about, a follow-up question I got was, what do you do now? Oh, is it still recording? I thought it like X'd out. Okay, well, so a follow-up question I got was, I'm gonna try to edit that out. A follow-up question I got was, okay, well, what do I do now? Yeah, do I start with the phenomenon? Do I start with kids generating questions? What to do next is like where this person gets stuck. So, and some of their ideas, like, do you just give them choice about which questions they research and then you just give them the lesson that matches up with it? Or are they going to complete those lessons and then come back with more questions? Or like, how do you do this, right? Okay, so here's my plan using this canned curriculum, creating this like mushy unit. This unit mushed from the other pieces, puzzle pieces. I don't know. I like to think of lessons as puzzle pieces too. That framework helps me understand. So my students engage with this phenomenon. Like I said, I still need to revamp that, but they engage with this phenomenon and they generate their list of questions, and we use a driving question board. You've probably heard that term before, but just it's like a list of questions or a piece of paper with all of the questions. So my thoughts are you should have one for the class, whether it's like a physical paper on a wall on the board, or it is a digital version where it has all of the students' questions on the page or whatever. And students should also have their own question list of their own like copy of that or questions in their own notebooks. So this has all of the questions that they thought of as well as the questions that the class thought of. I also following that, I like to spend time like organizing and sorting through the questions, because when we're in the question phase, we're just throwing out all of our different ideas. There are literally no wrong questions. There's nothing that cannot be put on that board. But then we start to think about, okay, well, first of all, then we start to just look for overlaps. So, if all of the kids are putting the same questions on the board, well, we don't need to have the same question or like most of the same question 12 times. We want to work as a class to come up with some kind of consensus of, okay, this question best voices that idea or best represents that idea or whatever. So we can like narrow and kind of eliminate some questions in that way. Not eliminating them because they're not important, but just because they're overlaps, right? We can also then start to think about like what questions are maybe less relevant to our learning goals right now. And I wouldn't necessarily eliminate those questions, but we might kind of want to move them to the side where like these are some really cool questions that maybe we'll get to, but are they going to help us address our learning goals? And how you get your students to understand their learning goals could be, I mean, you could just show them the standards and talk about them. Like, this is the standards. This is how I know you know it. This is what we need to hit. This is what we need to understand. You could also, and I like to do it where my anchor experience, the way I engage my students with the phenomenon, actually sets the tone for like what they have to do and what they have to know. So one example for this is like one of my anchor experiences for a unit in my own curriculum is students are basically tasked. They take on this role of working at a zoo or whatever, and they are applying for a grant, or they're researchers or something like that, applying for a grant from a zoo to protect an important species. So the task is, here's this koala species, and you have to, on this grant application, like help us understand, and it's like a genetics unit and an environmental like changes unit or whatever. So the grant is to help them understand why this species is like unique and important, and why it's important right now. So the outline of the project that basically they're going to be working on throughout the unit, or like they could be working on throughout the unit, sets the framework for the unit. They need to understand like why are koalas so unique and different, and that gets us into like their genetics and their adaptations and all of that. And then the whole like why is this important now gets into those like environmental changes and the disruptions and all of that. So the anchor experience actually presents a task that creates the boundaries for my unit. And therefore, when we are generating our list we've generated our list of questions, now we're evaluating those questions. We can ask ourselves, like, does this question support completing this project? And so a question about, I don't know, something that's not relevant to koalas, like how do I buy a koala? Is that going to support our grant application? No. I think it might be interesting. Maybe you could investigate how you buy a koala. I don't know. But that's not going to support our grant application. So we can kind of put it to the side. So, because we know our students sometimes they ask silly questions. Sometimes they ask like legitimate questions, but they're just outside of the scope of our unit. The way we present our anchor present or engage our students with our anchor can create those boundaries for us and give us something to like evaluate our questions based on. Okay, so we sort our questions, we've eliminated some or put some to the side, and now we start to think about like, well, where do we go from here? And I think if you become really, really familiar with your curriculum, which is not going to be me this fall, but if you're really, really familiar with your curriculum and your content, you could theoretically have students pursuing different questions at the same time. And you could do as this question asker asked me, like, do you have these individual students? They ask the question, they decide what they want to investigate, and then you like point them in the direction of like the canned lesson and the curriculum lesson, and then they come back and then like do the next one. If you have a really strong grasp of, first of all, I guess if your students are ready for that, and if you have a really firm like foundation and understanding of and knowledge of the curriculum, that you could be like, oh, that lesson, you need to go use this lesson. You need to go investigate this resource. You need to go like whatever. You could probably do that. For me, because this is the first time I will be using this curriculum, and also I don't know that my students are like going to be ready for that type of totally independent kind of thing. And you could even do it like individual, or it could be like small groups of students. That's like what you'd have that, all those things going on at the same time. For me though, with not being familiar with the curriculum and not, and maybe my students are not ready for that, I'm going to work toward class consensus. So my goal is for it to still be student driven, but as a class, we are going to work to decide like, well, what is our next step as a class? So we will like look at our questions. Then we've eliminated some. We're going to look at, okay, well, what should be our first question? Like, what should we investigate first? And there could be variety. Like there could be things that we might be able to look at those questions and be like, okay, before we can answer these ones over here, we need to actually understand what's right. We need to understand this idea here. So that can help us decide. We might also be able to just think about like, well, what are we most curious about? So for the unit that I'm creating from this like combination, there's kind of these 3 options of areas to investigate. And honestly, I don't think that any particular one needs to come before another. So I would kind of ask my students like, they're like stops. Which stop do you want to go to? Do you want to go to Saturn, or do you want to go to Venus, or whatever it is? And interest can be a deciding factor for where we go next. But you can also use like, so you could use like that. What do we need to know first? You can think about like, well, what are we most interested in or curious about? Or you could do like, what is going to help us? What do you think is going to make the biggest impact in accomplishing our task? So if I go back to that endangered genomes, what is going to make that's the koala thing. Which question is going to like make the biggest impact in getting our grant application put together? So, and then you can kind of go from there. And depending on where students start, it's going to unfold in a different way, but that's like how I get to the starting point. I would not necessarily, like I said, I personally am not ready with this curriculum, or even with my students, to have them just be like, everybody, all 25 kids have their own question and I'm just like matching up lessons. I'm not planning to do that. I think someday it would be really awesome if students can really truly pursue their own learning in that sense, and take it on their own route. That said, I think there is value in not having students do that, and really having them work as teams and to collaborate and build consensus and figure out where to go working together, because collaboration is a 21st century skill that our students need to have. So I think I probably personally will never go the full route of everybody's doing their own thing, but I think there's definitely space for, we don't have to build class consensus. Someday we will build maybe small group consensus, and then students can kind of move into the group that matches their initial interest, and then as a group like flow into where they need to go. But again, I'm building this fall. We are building class consensus because I don't know the curriculum that well, and this allows me to guide my students better, because we're going to kind of all be on the same page in terms of what we're exploring at that moment. And then we can, again, every single time we have that wrap up, like we've discovered something, we can determine now where do we go? Going back to our big list of questions, making up our new questions, determining what comes next. And that's when I can then go back into the curriculum and see like which puzzle pieces, which lessons make the most sense now that we have this new question to investigate. So that's where I'm going with this. If you have additional questions about working with a canned curriculum, Erin just released a podcast episode on the Teaching Science in 3D podcast yesterday, Monday. So I would encourage you to check that out. This kind of overview is my plan and what I am responding to the person who sent me the question about it. And if you have questions that you would like me to answer, please hit reply and post your question. If you're watching this on YouTube, post it below. If you're watching this via email, hit reply, and I would love to take some time to answer those. Thanks for joining me today. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.